I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
The document was only 1 page long, but the moment King Charles placed it on the table, the atmosphere inside the palace changed completely. Princess Anne had entered the room demanding answers. Camilla's newly granted position was now under direct threat. Within minutes, Charles was forced to revoke his wife's appointment as Royal Patron of the Queen Elizabeth II Service and Remembrance Trust, and the decision struck at the heart of his marriage, his authority, and the monarchy's fragile unity. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles read Anne's formal objection twice, then removed his glasses. A royal patronage is an official link between a senior royal and a charitable organization. He had approved Camilla only days earlier, believing the role would strengthen her standing as queen and prove she could guard his mother's legacy. Now that choice threatened to expose a deeper fracture. Anne entered carrying a sealed evidence file. She did not shout. She placed it beside the appointment paper and told her brother this was no longer about pride or old wounds. It was about protecting Queen Elizabeth's name. The trust had been created to preserve the late monarch's military service, national duty, and charitable commitment. It could not become an instrument of private influence. Charles pushed back. He said the appointment was his decision, and warned that reversing it would humiliate his wife before she had begun. Anne held his gaze and opened the file. Inside were dated records showing that the process had been accelerated and that a required consultation for patronages tied to the late Queen's legacy had been bypassed. The king's anger hardened, but the Princess Royal had not finished. She produced a documented internal memorandum showing that Camilla's office had already attempted to reshape the trust's leadership and redirect its funding priorities before the appointment was announced. Charles read in silence. His resistance began to collapse because the problem was no longer how the decision looked. It was what had already been done in Camilla's name. Silence pressed between them. Charles reached for his pen, knowing one signature would wound his marriage, while refusing could damage the crown's claim to duty. At that moment, Camilla received a message from her private secretary confirming that Anne was inside the king's room. She abandoned her engagement and headed toward them without looking back. But before the ink could dry, footsteps approached the closed door, and Charles realized that the decision he had delayed for days was about to become a confrontation between the two women he could least afford to lose. This was never merely a disagreement over a ceremonial title. For Anne, the appointment represented an invasion of her mother's legacy. For Camilla, it was proof that she had finally been trusted with something sacred, rather than merely tolerated beside the throne. And for Charles, it was meant to be an act of loyalty toward his wife. Instead, the decision placed him between a sister who would not retreat and a queen who had spent decades refusing to be pushed aside. Anne had spent years building her reputation through military charities, remembrance ceremonies, and veterans organizations. She believed royal patronage, the formal support a royal gives to a charity or public cause, had to be earned through steady service, not handed out as a reward for rank. That belief came directly from her mother, who had treated duty as something proven over time. Camilla saw the appointment differently. When the original letter arrived, she sat alone for several minutes, tracing the embossed crest before Charles entered. She told him quietly that his mother would never have imagined her holding such a position. He reassured her that the role was not an act of forgiveness or convenience. It was proof that she belonged at the center of royal life. That promise made the revocation cut deeper. Camilla feared the loss would confirm what she had always suspected, that some senior royals still viewed her place as conditional, and that the late Queen's legacy remained a boundary she would never be allowed to cross. She had survived public hostility, private judgment, and years of comparison. Yet this humiliation came from inside the family. Anne carried a different pain. Alone with an old handwritten note from Queen Elizabeth, she read the words on service and responsibility before folding the paper with care. The message had been preserved in a private family archive, a collection of personal documents kept away from public view. Her decision was no longer about whether Charles would be hurt. It was about whether silence would betray the values their mother had left behind. Charles had been warned. A senior courtier had spoken to him privately and cautioned that his sister might object, but he dismissed the concern. He believed Anne would never challenge a decision involving Camilla, especially one he had approved himself. That confidence now looked dangerously misplaced. Then William received an urgent call from a palace advisor. The prince did not immediately defend his father, nor did he side with his aunt. He asked only one question. What exactly had Camilla's office tried to change inside the trust? The answer would transform the dispute from a painful family disagreement into a question of influence, control, and whether the Queen's new authority had already reached too far. Every royal rupture has a moment that appears insignificant until the consequences arrive. In this case, it happened during a private reception at Windsor Castle, 3 evenings before the revocation. There were no raised voices and no public scandal. There was only a funding list, an empty chair, and one sentence from Camilla that Anne could not forget. From that moment forward, the appointment was no longer symbolic. It had become a direct contest over who controlled the late Queen's legacy. Camilla arrived expecting a smooth beginning. The private reception had gathered trustees, military representatives, charity leaders, and palace officials to prepare the trust's first national remembrance initiative. The trustees were the people legally responsible for protecting the charity's money and purpose, while the funding cycle was the first formal round in which projects would be selected for financial support. Anne attended because a veterans rehabilitation program she had backed for years had already been chosen as a principal beneficiary. The meeting changed when Camilla leaned toward the trust secretary and asked for the program to be removed from the opening announcement. She proposed replacing it with a community initiative recommended by one of her senior advisors. The Queen Consort spoke calmly, but the decision landed with force. Anne had spent years supporting wounded servicemen through recovery, and the late Queen had personally encouraged the same program during the final years of her reign. Anne remained seated as revised papers moved around the table. She asked whether the trustees had approved the change. Camilla answered that the arrangement would be formalized after her patronage began. The Princess Royal closed her folder slowly and said, "Then the appointment has already been used before it has even begun." Her words ended the discussion, but they did not end the conflict. Camilla understood the challenge immediately. She believed the new initiative would modernize the trust and widen its public reach, yet Anne saw something darker. Removing a project tied directly to their mother's service record felt less like reform and more like rewriting history. Neither woman raised her voice. That restraint made the moment more dangerous. A nervous courtier found Anne later and handed her a documented internal memorandum. It proposed giving Camilla's office approval rights over future grants, public speeches, and trustee appointments. The memorandum was only a draft, but its reach was unmistakable. Anne left Windsor without confronting Charles. Instead, she contacted 2 trustees privately, gathered the revised funding papers, and began assembling a case the king could not dismiss. By the following morning, Anne was no longer asking whether the appointment should be reconsidered. She was preparing to prove that Charles had to revoke it. When Camilla entered the king's private sitting room, she expected to find Charles defending the decision he had made. Instead, she saw the revocation order beside his hand, and Anne standing across from him, motionless and unyielding. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Camilla looked at the document, turned toward the Princess Royal, and asked whether this had been her intention from the beginning. Anne's reply ensured that the meeting could never return to polite royal restraint. Charles dismissed the aides and closed the door himself. A revocation order is the formal document used to withdraw an appointment that has already been approved, and its presence meant the argument had moved beyond warning. With no secretaries, advisors, or courtiers left inside, the dispute became brutally personal. Camilla learned in that moment that the king was prepared to sign, even though he insisted the decision had not yet been finalized. Camilla turned on Anne. She accused her of using the late Queen's memory as a weapon, one designed to decide who truly belonged within the monarchy and who would always remain outside its deepest traditions. The Queen Consort had endured years of public hostility, but this challenge felt more intimate because it came from the woman who guarded Elizabeth's legacy most fiercely. Anne did not raise her voice. She told Camilla that belonging was not the issue. Authority without accountability was. Then the Queen Consort reached across the table and moved the revocation paper away from Charles. The Princess Royal calmly returned it to the exact place before him. That small gesture carried more force than shouting. Neither woman looked away. Anne opened the evidence file and produced the internal memorandum. It proposed broad approval rights for Camilla's office over grants, speeches, and future trustee appointments. A trustee appointment is the formal selection of someone responsible for protecting a charity's purpose and finances. Camilla recognized the document immediately, but insisted it was only a preliminary administrative proposal, written by an advisor without her final approval. Charles asked the question that ended every excuse. Had she instructed the Windsor secretary to remove Anne's Veterans Program from the funding announcement? Camilla paused. The silence answered first. Then she admitted she had supported a change in direction because she believed the trust needed a wider public purpose. The king picked up his pen. Before signing, he warned Anne that forcing this decision would affect every senior royal and change how future appointments were handled. Anne did not step back, and Charles lowered the pen toward the page. Knowing the signature would not merely cancel a patronage, it would declare which principle he valued more than domestic peace. The revocation was delivered to Camilla in the same red box that had carried her original appointment. She recognized it before the lid was fully opened. This time, there was no congratulatory note, no reassurance, and no promise of a new chapter. There was only a formal sentence confirming that the king had withdrawn his approval. Camilla read it once, placed it beside her untouched tea, and asked everyone except her sister to leave the room. Camilla listened as the consequences arrived one after another. Her scheduled visit to the trust's headquarters was canceled. Her name disappeared from the forthcoming program, and palace staff began removing every reference to the appointment from prepared announcements. The red box, a secure case used to carry official royal papers, had delivered not authority, but humiliation. The trust moved quickly. Its leaders announced internally that an interim non-royal chair would oversee operations until a new patron could be chosen through a revised consultation process. An interim chair is a temporary leader appointed to keep an organization stable during a transition. That decision mattered because it removed royal influence from the trust at the very moment public confidence was most fragile. Camilla waited until the door closed before speaking. She told her sister that this was not simply the loss of a role. It was Charles choosing Anne's judgment over her dignity, even before the public statement had been released. The queen consort had spent years proving she could endure hostility. This wound felt different, because it came from the man who had promised she finally belonged. Charles arrived later, but Camilla did not rise. She asked whether he believed she had acted dishonorably. The king answered that he believed she had moved too quickly. He tried to separate intention from consequence, but the distinction gave her no comfort. She heard only that he had signed the order. Then Camilla admitted the part she could no longer avoid. Her senior advisor had drafted the governance memorandum after receiving broad verbal instructions to modernize the trust. She had not approved every clause, but she had encouraged the direction and failed to stop it. That failure now carried her name. Anne received confirmation of the revocation in her office. She showed no triumph. The Princess Royal removed her mother's handwritten note from the evidence file and held it in silence, understanding that protecting one legacy had damaged 3 living relationships. That evening, Charles asked Anne to meet him without secretaries, documents, or advisors. For once, he wanted no monarch and no princess in the room, only a brother and sister. With the institution temporarily protected, and Camilla deeply wounded, the next decision would be shaped not by regulations, but by a private conversation between the two people who had inherited the Queen's sense of duty in very different ways. There were no files on the table when Charles met Anne that night. No private secretaries waited outside with briefing notes, and no ceremonial language softened what had happened. The king poured 2 drinks, but neither touched them. Then he asked his sister a question he had avoided throughout the crisis. Had she forced the revocation to protect their mother's legacy, or because she had never accepted Camilla as part of it? Anne's answer changed the emotional meaning of the entire conflict. Charles had chosen Clarence House because the familiar rooms carried fewer barriers between them. Clarence House is the royal residence where the king conducts private family meetings away from the formality of the main palace. He wanted no advisors, no official record, and no chance for either of them to hide behind rank. The appointment, he explained, had been meant to give Camilla a meaningful duty linked to national service, not control over Queen Elizabeth's memory. Anne listened before answering. She admitted that she had struggled with the way royal history could be reshaped through new titles, public statements, and carefully managed narratives. The Princess Royal knew how easily a symbolic role could become a claim over the past. Yet she insisted that her objection had not begun with Camilla's name. It had begun when the trust's funding plan was altered, and a veterans program tied to their mother was pushed aside. Charles lowered his voice. He confessed that signing the revocation had made him feel he had failed his wife, after asking her to endure years of criticism for his sake. The monarch had promised that patience would eventually bring acceptance. Now he had handed Camilla a role, then taken it away under pressure from his own sister. Anne did not soften the truth. She told him that shielding someone from humiliation could never mean shielding them from accountability. Then she made the one admission Charles had not expected. She did not want the patronage for herself. Anne recommended that the trust remain under independent leadership for 1 year. Independent leadership meant placing control temporarily with non-royal trustees, so no family member could use the crisis for personal gain. Her proposal removed any suspicion that she had forced the revocation to claim authority. Charles finally acknowledged what pride had hidden. He had rushed the appointment because he wanted to settle every remaining doubt about Camilla's standing. In trying to prove her authority, he had granted responsibility before trust had been secured. The king rose and decided to meet his wife immediately. He would offer her another path, but it required honesty, public duty, and acceptance of what had gone wrong. The revocation could not be undone, but Charles now understood that the monarchy's recovery depended on whether Camilla responded with bitterness or accepted the painful limits of her new position. By sunrise, the palace could no longer contain the story. The revocation moved from private rooms into television studios, newspaper offices, veterans' halls, and the gates of Buckingham Palace. What had begun as a disagreement over charitable governance became a national argument about loyalty, legitimacy, and Queen Elizabeth's legacy. Yet one image came to define the public reaction. Anne arriving alone at a Remembrance engagement, her face composed as the crowd suddenly began applauding. The palace moved first. It issued a brief statement confirming that Camilla would not assume the patronage, and that the trust's governance arrangements would face an independent review, meaning an outside examination of how decisions had been made and whether proper safeguards had been followed. The wording was careful, but the meaning was explosive. The monarchy had admitted that the appointment process itself now required scrutiny. Broadcasters seized on the divide. One channel described Anne's intervention as unprecedented, while palace commentators argued over whether Charles had shown weakness by yielding to his sister or strength by correcting a flawed decision. The king read a briefing showing public opinion split almost evenly. He felt relief that the trust had been protected, but frustration that the story was being framed as his wife's defeat, rather than an institutional correction. Camilla watched the coverage privately. She remained still until one presenter called the revocation the Queen's first major boundary. The phrase struck harder than the official statement. It suggested that her authority now had a visible limit, and that the country had watched that limit being enforced. The Queen Consort turned off the television before the panel began debating how much influence she should hold in future. Outside Buckingham Palace, the reaction became impossible to ignore. The fictional Morning Chronicle printed the revoked appointment letter beside a photograph of Anne, under the headline, "Duty Before Family." Copies were lifted above a gathering near the gates as broadcasters reported live. The image reduced a complex crisis to one brutal choice, and the public understood it instantly. Anne faced the reaction later at the National Memorial Arboretum, a national site dedicated to honoring those who served and sacrificed. Veterans began applauding as she arrived. The Princess Royal paused, lowered her head, and redirected attention toward the servicemen being recognized. She refused to treat the moment as victory. Camilla made her decision before the day ended. She requested a private meeting with Anne, not to recover the patronage, but to determine what could survive after the humiliation. The public had already formed its judgment, but the final meaning of the crisis would be decided away from the cameras, when Camilla and Anne met, without Charles standing between them. Anne entered the final meeting expecting anger. Camilla entered carrying the revoked appointment letter. Neither woman offered an apology for defending what she believed, yet both understood that the monarchy could not survive if every disagreement became a permanent wound. Camilla placed the letter on the table and admitted that her office had crossed a boundary. Anne acknowledged that forcing Charles to act had caused pain she could not dismiss. What followed was not reconciliation through affection, but peace through honesty. Camilla confirmed that she would accept the revocation, dismiss the advisor who drafted the overreaching governance proposal, and support the trust's independent review. The review was an outside examination of how decisions had been made and whether proper rules had been followed. No aides sat beside them at Windsor. No advisors softened their words. The Queen Consort accepted that the institution needed protection, even when that protection came at her expense. Anne agreed to remain on the advisory council only temporarily. The council was the group responsible for offering guidance without controlling the trust's daily work. She repeated that she would not accept the patronage herself. The Princess Royal understood that taking the role would turn the crisis into a contest with a winner and a loser, making the trust look like a prize claimed after a family battle. Camilla spoke with painful honesty. She said losing the position had hurt, but realizing why Charles had granted it hurt more. The king had partly used the appointment to prove she belonged. Now she understood that legitimacy could not be created by a signature, a title, or a public announcement. It had to be built through trust. Anne admitted her own failure. She had acted forcefully because she feared watching their mother's service legacy become a political tool inside the family. Yet she accepted that her severity had made Camilla feel judged for her entire past, rather than one flawed decision. The two women did not become close, but they reached something stronger than false affection, clear boundaries and mutual honesty. Charles later announced a revised patronage code, a set of rules requiring independent consultation, written safeguards, and transparent limits whenever a working royal joined a charity connected to a deceased monarch's name or legacy. Months later, Camilla accepted a different role involving literacy and domestic support. This time, the process was followed, and Anne privately sent her a handwritten note wishing her success. The intervention did not destroy Camilla's place, and it did not permanently weaken Charles. It proved that love could influence royal judgment, but never replace accountability. The Queen lost one appointment and gained a more defensible purpose. The king corrected his mistake. Anne protected her mother's legacy without claiming it. The signed revocation remained in the royal archive, not as evidence of victory, but as proof that the crown endured because duty was allowed to prevail. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.